My name is Jonathan Harper. I work as a private investigator in a small town in the Midwest. This place has always seemed quiet and peaceful, where even the worst crimes are thefts from local shops. But one day, everything changed. That morning, I woke up to a ringing on the phone. It was the local police chief, an old friend named Mike. He sounded unusually tense. "John, we need your help. Something strange is going on here, and I don't want to divulge the details over the phone. Can you come to our branch?" I wondered what could possibly be bothering Mike so much. Knowing that he was not one to panic for no reason, I quickly gathered myself and drove to the police station. Mike met me at the entrance when I arrived. He looked pale and tired. "Follow me," he said without explaining anything further. We went through the back door and found ourselves in a small conference room. There were several policemen and several other persons whom I did not know. There were photos on the table. I broke into a cold sweat when I saw what was on them. They were victims, and not just victims. They were bound, with faces distorted by horror. I noticed something in one of the photos that made me shudder. The phrase, "You're next," was written in blood on the wall behind the victim. Mike stepped forward and said, "We found them this morning. There were 5 of them, and they all disappeared on different days in the last 2 weeks. We have no suspects and no leads, but this inscription..." He pointed to the photograph. "That means he's not done yet." I could feel my heart start to beat faster. It was like a terrible dream, but unfortunately it was reality. It seemed that the world around me was shrinking. There was a feeling of something wrong in the air. I looked at Mike and saw my horror reflected in his eyes. "What do we have at this point?" I asked, barely holding back my nervousness. Mike leaned over the table and began to explain. "We found them in one of the abandoned houses on the outskirts of the city. All the victims were brutally murdered, but there were no traces to indicate who did it. The only catch is this inscription. And yet..." He stopped, as if he didn't want to continue. "What else?" I asked insistently, feeling like I was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. "We found the camera. She was hidden in one of the corners of the room. It records part of what happened, and the last moments of these people's lives." It was as if cold water had been poured over me. I've always considered myself immune to anything horrible I might see in my work, but even the thought of watching a video like this made me cringe. However, I knew that this could be the key to the solution. "Do you want to see it?" Mike asked, holding a flash drive in his hand. I nodded, trying to hide my inner anxiety. Mike inserted the flash drive into the laptop and started the video. A dark room appeared on the screen. It was visible how the victims appeared one by one in the frame, bound and with gags in their mouths. Their faces were full of horror, and then a figure appeared, a shadow coming closer to the camera. A man in a mask. His eyes were the only thing that could be seen, and they were cold, merciless. He approached one of the victims and the video cut off. My head was spinning. I felt a wave of terror wash over me. This maniac did not just kill people, he enjoyed their fear, turning their death into a spectacle. Mike turned off his laptop and looked at me. "We have to find him, John, and quickly. Otherwise, we'll find even more videos like this." I took a deep breath, trying to compose myself. It was more than just an investigation. It was a hunt for the monster that lived among us, and worst of all, he seemed to enjoy the game. We continued our discussion, trying to find at least some clues that could lead us to the trail of this killer. But the more we looked at the collected evidence, the more we realized that it was a real horror. He proceeded carefully, leaving no trace but his victims. This was someone who knew what he was doing. I sat in the conference room feeling a fog of despair fill my brain. I suddenly remembered that our town has a local crime expert, Professor Kevin Lane, a former FBI profiler. I quickly dialed his number and asked to meet. An hour later, I was sitting in his office talking about what had happened. Lane listened intently, taking notes from time to time. He was a middle-aged man with gray hair and deep lines on his face that showed years of experience dealing with the worst aspects of human nature. "This is a very organized killer," Lane said when I finished my story. "He has a clear plan and acts methodically. You said the victims had nothing in common except that they disappeared at different times. This could mean that he chooses his victims at random, which makes him even more dangerous." "What can we do?" I asked, feeling helpless. Lane looked into my eyes, his gaze cold and serious. We have to find a connection between the victims, even if it's something very minor. Otherwise, we will be playing a game with someone who knows how to win it. But there's one more thing. He paused for a moment, as if hesitating whether to say it. I think this killer wants to be caught. His "You're next" caption is a challenge. He knows you will be looking for him, and this is his entertainment. His words made me feel cold. The idea that the killer was playing some kind of perverted game with us was terrifying. But that meant we had a chance to find him. We just had to understand his rules. The next few days passed in complete commotion. We looked at all possible evidence, analyzed crime scenes, and talked to relatives of the victims. But nothing gave us a direct trail. It was like a gloomy puzzle, the parts of which did not fit together. But one evening, when I was ready to give up, the bell rang. It was Mike. He said he received an anonymous call. Someone saw a suspicious man near one of the abandoned houses on the outskirts of town where the bodies were found. I knew instantly that this could be our chance. We had to act quickly. Mike, several officers, and I got into cars and drove to the location. Night had fallen, and our headlamps were the only source of light in the darkness. As we approached the abandoned house, I felt my adrenaline rush. We got to the door, and Mike motioned for us to be quiet. We went inside. The air was cool and damp, and there was a musty smell in the air. We moved carefully, trying not to make any noise. Suddenly, I heard a soft sound. It was something like a whisper. I stopped, trying to determine where it was coming from. Then I saw it. A faint light flickered at the far end of the room. We got closer and saw that it was coming from the basement. My heart was pounding as we started down the stairs. What will we find down there? We reached the basement and saw him. The man was standing in front of us with his back to us. He didn't move. The same message as before was written on the wall across from him. "You're next." I felt a wave of fear wash over me. He knew we would come. The man stood motionless, his figure covered in shadow. I could feel the adrenaline boiling in my veins. This was the moment we were waiting for. Mike took a step forward, pointing the gun at the man. "Hands up now!" His voice was determined, but I noticed a slight tinge of anxiety in it. And suddenly the man began to slowly raise his hands, but at the same time he turned to us. He had a mask on his face, the same one we saw in the video. Those eyes, cold, merciless, they looked straight at me, as if piercing through. My heart froze with horror. "I knew you'd come," he croaked, his voice low but eerie. He seemed to be enjoying the situation. "You always come, and you're always late." Mike took another step forward, ready to arrest him, but the man suddenly threw something on the floor. I heard the sound of broken glass and instantly knew what it was. Gas! He was going to poison us. I shouted, "Back! We retreat!" We started running towards the basement exit, trying to avoid the poisonous smoke. But the man began to laugh. This laughter pierced the air like the sound of broken glass. He was crazy, and it was obvious. We managed to get out of the basement, swallowing fresh air. I felt my heart beating loudly in my chest. At that moment, I realized that we were dealing with a creature that was enjoying our fear. He played with us like a cat with a mouse, and it was unbearable. Mike, still breathing hard, turned to me. "He's not just a killer, he is sadistic. He wants us to see his work. He's enjoying it." I nodded, trying to compose myself. We couldn't let him get away. It was a matter of life and death, not only for us, but for whoever he might choose as his next victims. We quickly organized ourselves and returned to the basement, this time armed with gas masks. But when we entered, the room was empty. There was no sign of the man. He disappeared. Only the inscription on the wall remained. "You are next." I felt the cold seeping into my bones. He overtook us again. We searched the entire house, but found no trace of his escape. It seemed that he simply dissolved into thin air. Feelings of helplessness and anger mixed in me, causing uncontrollable anger. We were so close, and he eluded us again. We returned to the police station, full of disappointment and anxiety. I sat in Mike's office trying to figure out what to do next. "He's playing with us," I said, barely holding back my emotions. "He enjoys the fact that we can't catch him, and this is just the beginning." Mike sighed heavily and shook his head. "We have to find a way to break this game. Stop him before he kills again." I recalled every detail of our investigation, trying to find any clue. And then it dawned on me. All the victims, all the crime scenes, they had something in common, something we missed. I took a map of the city and began to mark the places where the bodies were found. With each mark, I had the idea that this was not a coincidence. They formed a certain pattern, something like a web. Mike, look at this, I pointed to the map. All crime scenes are located around a certain point. This is not accidental. Maybe this is some place where he is hiding. Mike came closer and looked at the map. Maybe, but what kind of place is this? We looked at the center of the web. It was an old factory that closed down a long time ago, a place that everyone has forgotten about for a long time. We should check this out, I said, feeling a new surge of energy. This could be our chance to catch him. And this time we were not to be mistaken. The next morning we gathered a group and went to the old factory. The place looked abandoned and neglected. The buildings overgrown with grass stood like monuments of the past, silent witnesses of long-forgotten days. But I felt there was something here, something we had to find. We split into two groups and began the search. It was hard not to feel the tension. Every sound seemed suspicious, every corner dangerous. We combed the premises one by one, trying not to miss any detail. And suddenly we came across it. A small room hidden behind an old wooden door. There was only a table and a chair inside. There was a notebook on the table. I picked it up and started looking through it. It was a diary of our maniac. My hands were shaking as I turned the pages. These were records of his hunting. He described every sacrifice, every step. His thoughts were cold and ruthless. But on the last page, I found something that gave me pause. There was a date, tomorrow's date, and the inscription, Final Scene. I was overcome with fear. He planned another murder, and it was supposed to happen tomorrow. I immediately contacted Mike. We found his diary. He plans another murder tomorrow. We need to act quickly. Mike nodded, and we quickly organized a plan. We could not allow him to carry out his plan. This was our chance to stop him once and for all. But fear grew inside me. What if we're late again? What if he overtakes us again? The next day came with a heavy sense of anxiety. We were ready to act, but we did not know where and when exactly he planned to perform his final act. It was like walking on thin ice, knowing that any step could be the last. We gathered all the police forces and began to search the city. Every officer was on the alert. Every corner was under surveillance. I looked through the diary again and again, trying to find any hint of the place. But he was too careful. He didn't leave any obvious clues. Suddenly there was a call on the radio. It was an officer patrolling the old city park. He reported seeing suspicious activity near the old amphitheater. The heart stopped. The old amphitheater was an abandoned place that became a shelter for the homeless and a place for teenagers seeking thrills, a place where there were no witnesses, a place that was perfect for the final act. We quickly gathered the team and went to the amphitheater. On the way, I could feel the adrenaline boiling in my blood. All my nerves were on edge. The sense of danger became almost palpable on a physical level. We had to make it. We couldn't let him get away again. When we arrived, the amphitheater looked abandoned and eerie. The old dilapidated tribunes and the stage, overgrown with weeds, looked like scenery for a terrible spectacle. The air smelled of dampness and rot. We split into two groups to go around the place from different sides. I walked with Mike, gun ready. Every step echoed in the empty corridors. Every sound seemed menacing. And then we heard it. A quiet, barely audible moan. We froze in place, listening. The sound came from the side of the stage. We quickly but cautiously moved closer. And when we looked behind the curtain, we saw her. The girl, bound and gagged, was lying on the floor. Her eyes were filled with terror. She looked as if she had been abused. I quickly rushed to her, trying to untie, but then I heard a quiet, creepy laugh. I turned and saw him. A masked man stood on the balcony looking down on us. He had a camera in his hands. He filmed everything that happened, enjoying our despair. "You've come to my final act," he said, his voice sending a chill through me. "I knew you couldn't miss it, but unfortunately, you are late again." Mike shot in his direction instantly, but he disappeared behind the wall. We ran to the exit, trying to catch up with him, but when we went up to the balcony, he was gone. All that remained was the camera, which continued to record. He left her to us as a mockery. I could feel the rage coming over me. How could he play with us like this, with the lives of these innocent people? I looked at Mike and saw the same anger and despair in his eyes. We rushed to find the killer, combing all corners of the amphitheater, but he disappeared. Again. We returned to the girl lying on the floor. She was alive, but in a state of shock. She was brought to the hospital, and I was relieved that at least this time we were able to save someone. Everyone was amazed. We gathered at the police station, trying to understand what had happened. The camera he left behind became our only key. We watched the video, hoping to find at least one clue to his identity or location. But instead we only saw him. In a mask, with a cold look, he stood in front of the camera. His eyes were empty, but with a hint of triumph. He was smiling. "You think you can stop me?" he said, his voice calm but sinister. "This is just the beginning. I gave you a chance. But you didn't manage. And now, the game begins again." I felt my heart stop. He meant that this was not the end. He planned to continue, to play with us, with the city, with the lives of innocent people. And the worst thing was that he believed in his impunity. Mike leaned back in his chair, rubbing his face tiredly. "We have to find him, John. He won't stop, and we can't stop either." I nodded, feeling the weight of the task. It wasn't just a maniac search. It was a race for survival, and we had to win, otherwise only fear and horror awaited us. We began to look at all possible clues, trying to make at least some kind of picture. We interrogated people who might know something, analyzed recordings from video surveillance cameras in the city, but each new detail only deepened our doubts. It felt like the killer knew our city like the back of his hand. He left no traces, made no mistakes. But there was one thing that bothered me. That laugh when we found the girl in the amphitheater. He sounded like we were just part of his perverted spectacle. Suddenly I remembered the local theater. Different people worked there, including those who played in productions. I figured I should check this trail out. Perhaps one of the actors might know something about that mask or the laugh, or who could be so adept at hiding their identity. Mike and I went to the theater, which was already closed by then. We had to wait until the morning to meet the director. He was an old man who had worked in the theater for many years. We told him about our situation and he looked worried. "We had a lot of actors," he said, "but none of them could do something like that. We are all like a family here." But when we showed him the mask, his face changed. He recognized her. "We used this mask in one of the productions a few years ago. She was part of a costume for one of the heroes, but I don't remember who played that role." We asked him to look through the archives, and after some time he found the name, David Marshall. He was an actor who disappeared after that production. No one knew where he was now or what had happened to him. But this hook was our only thread to hang on to. We started looking for information about David Marshall. It turned out that he was a talented actor, but after that production his career went downhill. His name disappeared from all the posters, and none of his colleagues knew where he was now. But there was something else. A few years ago, he entered a psychiatric hospital where he was treated for severe depression. This got me thinking. Perhaps his disappearance and this urge to violence are somehow connected. We found his family's contacts, but they didn't know anything about his current whereabouts. Only one of his former colleagues, whom we met by chance, told us that David always had a penchant for eccentric roles. He was fascinated by the roles of thieves and psychopaths. We gained access to the archives of the psychiatric hospital where he was treated. There we found his records. He wrote about dark thoughts, about the desire to control others, about how he felt alienated from the real world. These records were creepy. They revealed his inner world, full of darkness and hatred. But what happened after he left the hospital? We didn't have any information about it. But one thing was clear. David Marshall could be our maniac. His skills as an actor, penchant for violence and alienation from reality, made him an ideal suspect. We decided to expand our search. If he lives in our city, we should have found him. Every policeman was on alert. Every person was under suspicion. We couldn't let him get away. Days passed, but we had no new information. The feeling of powerlessness became unbearable. We knew that he was here somewhere, that he continued to watch us, to play with us, but we could not find him. And then one evening, the bell rang. It was Mike. He looked excited. "John, we received an anonymous call. Someone saw a man who looked like David Marshall near an old factory outside of town. We have to check it out." We gathered a team and went to the factory. It was an old, neglected place that had not been used for a long time. Its huge hulls, covered with rust and broken glass, stood like ghosts of the past. The wind whistled through the broken windows, creating eerie sounds. We went inside, trying not to make too much noise. Every step echoed, every sound seemed suspicious. I could feel my heart beating faster and faster. It could be him. We could be very close. We split up and began the search. They combed every room, every corridor, but everything was empty. A sense of hopelessness began to overtake me again when suddenly I heard a scream. I rushed at the sound and saw Mike standing in front of a large metal door. He screamed as he tried to open them. I ran over and helped him. We opened the door and went inside. What we saw was horrifying. The room was filled with photos and videos of his victims. On the walls were pictures on which he shot his masterpieces. In the center of the room stood a table on which masks, tools, and notes lay. This was his lair. And then we saw him. He stood in the corner, calmly watching us. His face was covered by a mask, but his eyes, the same cold, merciless eyes, looked at us with contempt. He did not try to escape. He stood like an actor on a stage, ready for the last act of his performance. Mike pointed the gun at him. "Give it up, David. This is the end." But he only smiled. "End?" His voice was calm, but there was a sense of triumph in it. "This is just the beginning. Don't you understand? It was only a prelude. The real show begins now." And suddenly he threw something on the floor. We reacted instantly, but it was too late. Thick smoke began to fill the room. I felt myself losing control, the air getting heavy. We rushed to the exit, but it was too late. He overtook us again. We gasped as we tried to find a way out of the room, which was quickly filling with smoke. My head felt dizzy, my eyes burned, every breath brought pain. I grabbed Mike's arm and pulled him towards the door, trying to keep him conscious. We barely made it outside, inhaling fresh air, coughing and catching every sip of oxygen. When the smoke cleared, we saw that David was gone. All that remained were his photos, videos, and a whole room filled with his madness. I could feel anger boiling in me. We were so close. We almost caught him, but he slipped away again. We called for reinforcements and began a thorough search of the factory premises, but to no avail. David disappeared, leaving us to his cruel game. He took us to this old factory like a stage and won again. When we got back to the station, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had missed something. What was in his words before he disappeared? "The real show begins now." What did he mean? I started going through the photos we had recovered from his den. All of them depicted his victims, their moments of fear and despair. But one photo caught my attention. It was an old poster from the theater where he used to play. A poster of some unfinished play that seems to have started all his problems. I remembered that the director of the theater mentioned this production, which was David's last. It was a play about a criminal who manipulates his victims, forcing them to do what he wants. It sounded a lot like what David did in real life. We decided to watch the recordings from this production to understand what had such a strong effect on him. When we got to the theater, the director showed us old rehearsal videos. We sat down and started looking through them. Young David appeared on the screen, enthusiastically playing his role. But with each new frame, we noticed how his game became more and more gloomy and strange. At one point, he goes on stage addressing an imaginary audience. His eyes were filled with pain and hatred. He talked about control, about power over others, about how he wanted to be understood and accepted. And then we heard a phrase that sounded like a lightning strike. "This is not just a performance. This is my reality." He said those words with such passion that Mike and I both felt chills run down our spines. This was the moment when David began to lose the line between the role and his own life. The moment when he became what he was now, a ruthless maniac. We looked at a few more records but didn't find anything new. Then I remembered the photo that had brought us here, the same poster. The name of the production and the date were written on it, and this date coincided with one of David's last attacks. It couldn't just be a coincidence. We decided to focus on the theatrical theme. It turns out that David used his performances as blueprints for his crimes. He recreated scenes from his roles in real life, choosing victims and scenarios that fit his vision. It was part of his sick mind, turning a fictional drama into a real tragedy. We started looking for information about all his productions, and they found that each of them had similar elements to his crimes. It seemed that he was trying to recreate scenes from these plays, as if he were a director who was staging his plays in real life. But what happened next? What performances remained unrealized? We had to know that to predict his next move. When we checked all the possible plays, we found one that caught our attention. It was a play about a serial killer who played with the police, leaving them clues and leading them by the nose. It was so similar to what David was doing now that I felt everything fall into place. That was his plan. He was creating his own final act. We couldn't let him finish that play. We knew that the next step would be the most dangerous, the most terrifying. He was preparing for his final act, for the moment when he would reveal himself to the audience, which he had been waiting for all his life. We gathered a team and started training. All policemen were warned about the possible next attack. We had to be ready for anything. David was smart and dangerous. He could do something incredible. All our suspicions were confirmed when we received an anonymous call. The voice on the other end of the line was calm, but there was a hint of irony in it. "Are you ready for the grand finale?" he asked. "Tonight, in the old theater. It'll wait." It was him. It was David. He himself invited us to his final act. It was a trap and we knew it, but we couldn't help but go. He could be holding hostages or planning something even more terrifying. We had to stop him. We headed to the old theater where it all began. Reinforcements and special forces were already on the spot. We surrounded the building, preparing for possible surprises. It was dark and quiet inside. Everything seemed frozen in anticipation. We entered, advancing cautiously. Every step echoed in the empty hall. The stage was illuminated by only one faint beam of light, as if it were the center of attention. And there, on the stage, stood David. He was dressed in his theater costume, with a mask over his face. His arms were spread wide, as if he was welcoming us into his kingdom. His eyes shone in the spotlight. "Welcome to you, viewers, to my grand finale." His voice sounded loud and clear. "This is the moment I've been waiting for. The moment when the truth will be revealed." We aimed our guns at him, ready to act, but he just stood looking at us with an ironic smile. "You think you can stop me? Don't you understand that this is all just a game? The game I made?" I could feel everything around me shrinking. We were here, caught him, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like something more, like part of his plan. And then I understood. He wanted us to be here. He wanted us to be part of his final act. "This is not the end," he said, his voice growing colder. "This is just the beginning. The real show begins now." And then the light went out. Darkness covered us, and I heard his laugh. It echoed in the hall, filling every corner. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. What was he up to? What happens next? The lights came back on, illuminating the scene. But David was gone. He disappeared, leaving us bewildered. I heard my colleagues calling out his name, trying to figure out where he had gone, but there were no answers. We split up and began searching the theater. I could feel my heart beating faster and faster. It was unreal. He disappeared before our eyes. I couldn't understand how it happened. When we searched the entire building and found no trace, I felt despair wash over me. He slipped away again. We were so close, but once again he was smarter than us. And then I noticed something on stage. It was a note left on the lectern. I went closer and read it. "The game continues. See you on the next stage." I felt everything inside me tighten. He wasn't going to stop. He continued his game, and we were just puppets in his hands. We returned to the station, discussing our next course of action, but I could feel everything boiling inside me. He used us. He played with us like dolls, and we had to find a way to stop him. The next day, we received a new tip. It was an email from an unknown address. It only had one sentence. "The drama continues. Are you ready for the next act?" It was a test. He wanted us to continue playing by his rules. But I decided that this time, we would be ready. We had to understand what would happen next, predict his next move. We decided to analyze his previous actions to understand his logic. He always followed a certain scheme, recreating scenes from theatrical productions. But what did that mean? Why these scenes? We had to find the answers. I spent the whole night watching tapes of his performances and comparing them to real crimes. And then it dawned on me. He chose scenes that symbolized his inner fears and desires. It was his attempt to express himself, to show his truth. But what will come next? What fear or desire did he want to express this time? I looked through the records again, trying to find clues. And then I understood. He wanted to show his last speech, his final truth. He wanted to reveal himself to us, to show his true essence. We went to the old theater again. This time we were ready. We surrounded the building, checked every corner. We knew he could be anywhere and we couldn't let him get away again. When we got inside, I felt a strange sense of déjà vu. Everything was like last time. Scene, light, silence. But this time there was no one on the stage, just one more note. I picked it up and read, "I've always been here. You just didn't see it. Today I will show you my true nature." I felt everything inside me getting cold. What was he planning? What did he want to show? We had to find out. We searched every corner of the theater but found nothing. And then I heard a soft sound, like someone crying. I got on the stage and started looking for the source of the sound. And then I found him. It was a small room behind the stage, hidden behind a curtain. When I entered, I saw something that made me freeze. It was a little girl, bound and gagged. She was crying, looking at me with fear in her eyes. I quickly untied her and she started to cry even harder. And then I heard his voice. "This is my last scene, my final act. You can see, I've always been here, among you." I turned and saw him. He stood in the shadows, looking at me with a cold smile. But it wasn't David, it was one of ours. He was a police officer who had been working with us all these months. He was inside the system. He knew our every step. I felt my heart stop. It couldn't be him. But it was him. David Marshall stood before us, embodied in another person. He fooled us all. "This is just the beginning," he said, his voice filled with triumph. "The real show begins now." And then the light went out.